In this chapter, we'll talk about minority groups and social movements that they've done to change our race relations in the United States. For social movements to occur, people must decide that they want to make some change in society. The change can occur through adaptation to situations they do not like, just fitting in, making the best out of it, or actually changing the situation that they do not like, actually changing social structures. Some do not change at all. Some just accept what's happening around them. And this is a sign of resignation, that they just gave up. They are led to accept the lower status and ideology of the dominant group. And we can see an example of this internalization of oppression through the Clark doll study, where in the 1950s, black students, young kids, were asked which doll was better looking, which doll was smarter, which doll was good. And these dolls were white versus black. And even the black kids chose the white dolls. Those who also resign to acceptance feel that they can do little to change the situation. They feel like there's no hope, and so they just accept what is. On the other side, there's those who pretend to accept the status. And this is a tactic to take advantage of the dominant group's prejudices. So on the surface, it looks like they have resigned, given up, and just doing what the dominant group says. But however, maybe behind the doors, they're actually making plans to change their situation or society as a whole. Another way to face oppression is to have displaced aggression. And this occurs through scapegoating. Scapegoating is when you blame a certain group for the oppressions or difficult times that you're having for your group. And this does not only happen between whites towards people of color, it also happens among minority group members. Usually minority group members in impoverished areas, since they cannot see those who oppress them, the elites, they fight one another. Again, they cannot strike back against the power structure. And so we have these things that we hear a lot today, like black on black crime, which is committing violence against one another. And this is more likely to occur in areas where there's predominantly one type of race. We just happen to hear more often now black on black crime through the media, but there's also high rates of white on white crime or Latino crime because they are near each other most of the time. We also see hopelessness and frustration in areas of concentrated poverty. They don't see people who've made it, and so kids may not see mentors and feel like, what's the point of trying hard when no one gets out of this area, no one gets out of the situation. We also see high rates of suicide. This is aggression turned inwards, and Native Americans have one of the highest suicide rates of all racialized groups in the United States. Again, they live in extreme poverty. Over 25% of the Native population live in extreme poverty. Again, we also see overall aggression against other minority groups. They don't get to see those in power who are really oppressing them, and so they attack one another. Avoidance also occurs, and it's just, trying to escape a situation, escape reality. And so to avoid oppression or feelings of oppression, discrimination, racism, minority groups may just try to avoid the majority group altogether. They may also try to avoid reality by having substance abuse problems such as drug and alcohol use. And we see that addictive drugs are more likely to be used by urban low-income African Americans and Latinos. So again, they're trying to escape reality. Another thing that they could do to change their current situation is to assimilate, to become part or wanting to become part of the dominant group, either because they see that they're doing well or want their privileges. Another part of assimilation is accepting the system but not attempting to change the system. So you're denying your own role within it. And as I discussed earlier in the semester, you can either perpetuate systems of oppression or dismantle them. And this is for all people, people of color and people of the dominant group. So with assimilation, a person in a minority group wants to become a part of the majority group. They have accepted the dominant group's culture and social institutions to try to find a place within them. Again, there's no real attempt to change the system. And minority groups members attempt to change his or her individual position within the system. They're not seeing or trying to help out other members of their racialized group. And we've seen this happen historically, at least in the African American community, with passing. It's when a person of African American descent with white phenotype, so very light skinned, maybe blue eyes, light hair, straight hair, fine features, leave the black community and attempt to infiltrate the white community. Not necessarily to become white, but for the privileges of whiteness. But the problem with this is that it causes a lot of psychological distress. You have to deny your identity. You have to live a double life and try to hide your blackness, your family, the way you grew up, all of that. Another type of assimilation is cultural assimilation, and is adopting the lifestyles, fashions, and values of the majority group. And a pop culture image that comes to my mind is Carlton from The Fresh Prince. Rarely see Carlton, at least in that show, exuding any blackness. So you have the lifestyle. He's very bougie, fashion, polo shirts and khaki pants, and other types of values of, at least in this case, well-to-do majority group members. We also see this in ethnocentric standards of beauty, that women of color feel pressured and accept dominant group ways of defining beauty, and that again is lighter skin, straighter hair, and finer features. It's a billion-dollar global industry. So you see products in the ethnic section in most stores where you have hair straightening products and skin lightening products. We also see assimilation occurring when parents Americanize ethnic sounding names. And I cannot go into a person's mind and tell you why they're doing that, but we know from research that those with ethnic sounding names are less likely to be picked out of a pile of applications for a job. Names like John and Sarah are more likely to be picked than Shaquanda or Tyrone from a pile of applications. It's also common that those in the middle class, people of color in the middle class, distance themselves from the poor people of the same racial or ethnic group. They say that we're different, we're better, we're not like those people who are stuck in urban plight. They would say things like, those are the ghetto people, we're not like them. So you see this separation, this intersectionality of race and class. So change-oriented responses, so knowing that the systems are not in your favor and wanting to change them, is what we're going to focus on here. So overall, it's an attempt to change the nature of race relations. It's an attempt to change the role that minority or in positions that minority group members face within these systems. So some goals could be a whole system-wide assimilation, that minority and majority groups share and create a common culture. So it's all built up together. There's no division within the system. There's no powerful group versus subordinate group. However, when we see assimilation happening in general and historically, we see that minority groups often adapt to the majority group. So overall, it's a good attempt, a good idea, but we still see it's more minority changing to majority group members' culture. Another idea is to build an alternative minority-controlled institution, and this is to preserve and strengthen minority group culture. So instead of trying to infiltrate and assimilate with majority group structures, they want to make their own and control their own. They want to build independent power base to make the group politically, socially, and economically stronger so they don't have to rely on anyone else or any other group aside from their own. So over time, we see a shift in terms of how people are responding to race relations. After World War II, it moved from adaptation to the majority group and towards effort to bring about change. So we see things like the Black civil rights movements and other types of movements. However, before this time, minorities have very few options but to adapt. And again, if they try to adapt without resources, without coalition of ideas, consequences could be very, very deadly. And after World War II, some groups outright rejected adaptation. They saw the subordinate status as just unacceptable. So we see, especially in the later 60s, started in the 70s, the Black Power movement, where blackness was something to be proud of. So it's not something to be ashamed of, something to change, something to wash off as if you could. It was something to internalize and be proud of. So A. Philip Randolph, he helped turn the black position in race relations, and he focused on the courts. He told President F.D. Roosevelt that he would organize a massive march on Washington, the Million Man March, if President Roosevelt did not ban job discrimination. And so during this time, we had black soldiers fighting for America, fighting for democracy worldwide, but at home facing incredible discrimination and racism. And so after this time, all military branches were finally, at least by law, could not segregate. And also, if this march were to occur, it would cause international embarrassment. At this time, America was trying to build itself up as the #1 country in the world. But if we're trying to have peace globally, democracy globally, but we couldn't provide it for our own people, then that would just make us look like hypocrites and embarrass us. So even though the laws have changed, there's limitations to them. As we see, governments seldom comply promptly with court orders. They look for loopholes, or in some courts in some states defied orders openly. Did not believe in equal rights for all people. And we also find that these laws were only applied to public sectors of discrimination, not to the private sector. So yeah, you could sit on the bus with other people, but could you go to the country club if you wanted to? Probably not. So Rosa Parks is one of the icons that we think of in terms of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And she was chosen by the NAACP, she was secretary of the time, in Montgomery, Alabama, to purposely not sit in the back of the bus. So she was used to cause conflict, and conflict, again, is not always bad. It's positive because it causes change. So she refused to give up her seat on the bus, and this led to a campaign to desegregate cities' bus systems. And this led to, past the bus boycotts, led to a larger movement headed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he was a new reverend. He was new to the Civil Rights Movement. He was 26, and they picked him. He was very eloquent. Could also he's a very charismatic person, and he followed nonviolent tactics of Mahatma Gandhi. And so, although other people can use violence to try to stop you, he used peace. That he would not do anything to harm others who would be the opposition. Other types of peaceful ways of changing the movement were freedom rides. And so this was also led by a lot of students, blacks and white allies, where they would ride to very prejudiced, racist, dangerous cities to share the movement and share that we don't want discrimination. All people are equal. We also have sit-ins where people again were trained to sit at these counters where they once were not, black people were not allowed to eat, and they were attacked violently. But again, they risked their lives, risked their own well-being for the benefit for all of society. Eventually, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech, which is still something that we have to think about. Have we actually realized his dream? This is 2015. Are all people equal? Do all people have the same rights? Yes or no? What do we need to do to actually reach that? We see later on a rising number of violent attacks on peaceful protesters. And during the later 60s, early 70s, we see it's no longer wait for things to change, wait for the oppressors to change their minds and change their hearts. Instead, we have this change to Black power. The civil rights movement, led by Dr. King and others, was more for the middle class, and it did not change the day-to-day living for the people in urban areas of extreme poverty. It replaced desegregation or integration as a goal, and just wanted to be able to live in their environment without oppression, without police brutality, without extreme poverty. And the leaders that we know of, at least most notably, are Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. And they had a very strong militant message of survival, economic equality, and political power. And again, they moved away from integration and the middle class needs and wants and talked more about the inner city life, how things were not changing for the poor. There was an increase in violent rebellions, especially after Dr. King died in 1967. And the most notable riots occurred in Watts, Newark, and Detroit. With Dr. King's assassination, it was the last straw. We see this boom of militant use of protecting one's community and protecting it from oppressors. We also have this time, we finally realized during this time that the return of the World War II veterans did not end discrimination. Black people were still not seen as Americans, although they fight for American wars. Same with Mexican Americans. And they formed the GI Forum, which would fight discrimination and raise voter registration. So black and brown people at this time, although they're fighting all these wars and battles for America, are not seen as citizens of America. And the Latina community, Cesar Chavez is one of the leaders, most notable leaders. He unionized agricultural laborers into massive strikes. Again, think about one of the most important industries in our country, agriculture, food. Most of our grapes, lettuce, tomatoes are coming from these farms that are maintained by Latino and Latinas, and they are not treated fairly at all. Like MLK, Chavez used Gandhian nonviolence techniques to grow the movement, to pass his message, to change things. On the other hand, like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, we see this militant side, this Reyes Lopez Terrina, and he wanted to restore the land to Mexican Americans, the land that was annexed from Mexico. And to get this to happen, he took forest rangers captive. So using very militant technique to make a point. Native Americans focused on treaty rights and unrestricted fishing. Again, Native Americans have been used for basically land theft. European settlers came in, colonized the country, took their raw resources, land, and decimated their food supplies and killed Native Americans through genocide. So, Native Americans were banding together, and like the Black Power movement, started the Red Power movement. The American Indian movement was founded in 1968, and they came together one notable place at Wounded Knee in 1973, and they met a violent confrontation with the oppressors. We also saw them take over Alcatraz Island, and again, this was to get back what was rightfully theirs. The Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972 is when they took over the BIA, which was a warden over many reservations of Native Americans. So for people to actually move in these types of directions, either to change the systems peacefully or radically and militantly, they have to have collective dissatisfaction. Basically, they have to be upset in a way that they'll actually do something. Also, relative deprivation has to occur. It's the experience of having less scarce resources than other individuals or groups, or less than what they believe to be fair. So you don't have to. You do not have an absolute state of poverty. So you're not in the survival mode. And again, for this to happen, for it to become a social movement, it must be a collective identity. Another tool is needed is a communication network. How are you going to spread this message? So communication is needed to act collectively. If we had people spread over the country and didn't have technology or ways of communication, various forms of media, it's very unlikely that a collective social movement would happen. And again, this network of communication is a way to share dissatisfaction, like what's going wrong in your community where you're at. We also have to have deep group consciousness, so really feeling like your identity is connected strongly to the group and the movement. Communication is needed to develop a plan and act it out. And again, communications is used to build a collective identity. Why should we do this together? Why should I, as an individual, risk myself and my livelihood for this group, for this movement? Also needed are resources. According to the resource mobilization theory, movements develop and spread when people who are dissatisfied have resources that they can use in this way. So you must have some source of money, influence, networks, and access to mass media. Also needed is a sense of efficacy. People must feel that they have something to gain by protesting and that potential gains outweigh any possible negative effects. So just imagine being on the bus boycott, sit-ins, or various forms of protest, and you're being attacked by fire hoses, by dogs, by people who just want to hurt or kill you. You must know that the movement has so much potential and that you are able to risk your life for this possible gain for all. The political process theory argues that people realize that the system is vulnerable to change through protest and become more likely to become involved in social movements. So again, this is when people become awake, when they know that the systems are flawed and there's a way to break it apart even more. Social movements need leadership. They need someone to plan strategies. They need someone to be very charismatic to inspire participants. And they also need someone who's on a grassroots level to do the day-to-day work with the rest of the members of the social movement. So we see that urbanization and industrialization also lead to the uprise of social movements. So we're moving past agriculture, moving into factories and machines and other forms of building up the economy. With this increase in the economy, we see increasing feelings of relative deprivation, that you don't have enough. People are more exposed to affluence and different lifestyles. They finally see, I don't have enough. I don't have what they have. We have increased competition, increased communication, and collective consciousness is also increasing. We also see that people have more freedom and greater independence in cities than they would have in agriculture, more rural areas. So during times of economic expansion, social movements are more successful. So when people are struggling financially or there's a recession, people are just trying to survive. And so to think about others on a collective level may not occur as much as it does during times of prosperity. Again, economic expansion raises expectations of minority groups by opening up new positions to them. So with increased social mobility, we also see them feeling like they can gain more and have the system change. Again, during times of economic expansion, minority groups are not much of a threat to the dominant group, at least in terms of jobs and other types of resources. And when all are doing better economically, there's more resources to benefit that movement. So we have more money and legal assistance. Mass communication is needed again because media can raise dissatisfaction by making people aware. So this could be spread through newspapers, radio, television. Today, we see it all the time through online sources. And again, this helps us see who's part of the haves and have-nots. So who has the bigger piece of the pie and why? Communication can also help facilitate exchange of ideas. So what's going on in California, someone from New York can read, and vice versa. We have exposure to ideas of leadership. So when these people are on platforms and speaking to the public, it spreads the ideas, the movement, and also we can see exposure to other protests elsewhere. So that may inspire more movement, stronger movement, more coalitions. Rising educational levels also help social movements. The leaders tend to have above average education, and this increases feelings of relative deprivation. So when you are doing well, you're not in dire straits, and you're educated, you're more awake, you have collective consciousness of what's going on, you're more likely to see how your group is deprived in some way. So also, those who have education have a way in with white dominant groups. White dominant groups are more likely to respond to minority demands because, again, they're more like them and they're speaking with the same type of language. International changes can also inspire social movements in the U.S. The emergence of independent nations and former colonies in Africa and other third world areas provided minority Americans with role models. We see that in various areas globally that when these people have fought, they fought for self-governance, for themselves, and self-determination. And with this, international changes, it forced American government to wise up and to be more supportive of the demands of equality. And again, since this is a global economy and we need allies, it makes America have to change. It demands change because we're competing with other nations for friendship.